So some people will say that that kind of tension and that kind of friction is perhaps also a little warranted at times, because there is a long-term policy view that you have, and the government, of course, has a short-term view on this. But given the context, and you've worked largely with two finance ministers, Mr. Pranab Mukherjee and Mr. P. Chidambaram, how different were the two gentlemen to work with? Were they completely stark in contrast?
That's a judgment you have to make, but there was a lot of difference in the way interactions between Mr. Chidambaram and the interactions with Mr. Pranab Mukherjee. Mr. Chidambaram, used to put across his arguments more firmly, more authoritatively, and more substantively, whereas Mr. Pranab Mukherjee or his team used to put across the arguments more subjectively. And Mr. Chidambaram believed that the Reserve Bank should be acting in acknowledgement of what he was doing towards fiscal consolidation, whereas in Mr. Pranab Mukherjee's time, the view was that the Reserve Bank must be more sympathetic to the government's point of view, because it should be more sympathetic to the concerns about growth.
Dr. Subbarao, your book very categorically says that differences will always exist between the central bank on one hand and the government of the day on the other. But, these were largely unsaid differences. This was for the media to speculate. This was for the media to spin stories around. Were you then surprised when Mr. Chidambaram, after your decision to not budge on interest rates, came out in the open and said that if the government has to walk alone, it will? Did it surprise you? Did it upset you? Did it take you by shock?
Well, it did surprise me. And it did upset me. Shock may be an extreme word. I was not shocked, but I certainly was upset, and I certainly was surprised.
Did it affect your relationship with him thereafter?
No, I don't think so. In the very short term, I write about some incident in Mexico, but certainly it did not impair our relationship. We did work professionally quite well for the rest of my tenure.
And he's one of the people who's endorsed your books, and actually viewers can see that he's endorsed this book. So I think there's a lot to be said about policy making in public spaces.
And it's a lot to be said about the personality. I think it's been very magnanimous on his part to have endorsed the book. And when I requested him for an endorsement, he agreed to give it even without asking to see the draft. So I thought he's been very generous.
We must also touch upon Raghuram Rajan, because your book very categorically talks about and does allude to the fact that how the central banker's position is largely apolitical. And your book talks about how during the campaign this issue came up, that his term will be terminated. It didn't happen. But we live in very interesting times indeed, and I'm again quoting from your book. Were you surprised by the vicious personal attack against the governor? And were you also equally surprised that the government of the day didn't really go out there in his defense? Because this wasn't just about the man, it was also about the institution that he represents.
Yeah, I was certainly, honestly, I was surprised by the level of attack, the quality of attack that was made against him, and the type of attack. But surprised about the government's reaction, I cannot really comment. The government has various calculations, whether it was deliberate or just happenstance. It's not for me to comment. But I was certainly surprised about the type of comments that were made against him.
Does it make you rethink the stuff that you put in the book, that perhaps the governor's position is no longer immune to politics?
Yes, now if actually you're right. I wrote that in early 2016.
That's right.
But after all this experience, perhaps I would not have written that paragraph.
Because you do believe there is a lot of politics now being involved in the governance.
I wouldn't say politics. But the office of the governor has come in for criticism on considerations beyond the policy domain.
And that you think is an unfortunate development? Or do you believe this is something that is a new reality we've got to live with?
I think it's unfortunate. As long as the governor is somebody who is doing his job, you can have differences with him on the policy, you can criticize him for his policy orientation, but I think to question the governor's credentials without any evidence, I think is unfortunate.